In this video, we're going to cover Dedenne and Cramorant's main skill, Tasty Chance S. I'm going to explain how to value this skill, and it involves pretty complex maths, but I will try to break it down for you guys. However, for those of you who don't want to hear the ramble on about the numbers and how to min-max, let me give you the summary first. So how does Tasty Chance S work? Every time this skill triggers, it will give you 4 to 10% extra crit chance, also called extra tasty, for the next meal. Should it not trigger the crit, then that crit chance gets kept for the next meal. If you trigger multiple times, the percentages will add up onto each other, and if you keep failing to get extra tasty, the numbers will keep going up until a maximum of 70%. Well, why 70%? Because the base crit rate for a dish when you're not using Tasty Chance S is 10% on a weekday and 30% on a Sunday. Meaning that if you've stacked Tasty Chance S enough, you will have a total of a 100% chance to crit on Sunday. Unfortunately, that crit chance cannot be carried over to the next Monday. It cannot cross over different weeks, unlike Cooking Power Up. Now, without going into any numbers yet, let's look at a qualitative analysis of how Tasty Chance can be best used. The first point is that the stronger your dish, the greater the returns from Tasty Chance. Because improving your crit chance, when your crit value is higher, for example, if you're cooking keema corn curry at 37,000 base strength, it's definitely worth more than if you were to just cook a dish with one ingredient and it's only 100 base strength. When keema curry crits, it's gonna be worth 70,000 strength, whereas when your single ingredient crits, you only get 20 strength. The second point is you should choose to use it when you are going to cook your strongest dish. For example, if you're alternating between keema corn curry and bean burger curry because of a lack of ingredients, so you can only cook one strong dish a day and the other 2 meals you're not cooking a very strong dish, you would hope that the crit happens on your strongest dish. Another way to look at this is if you're using Cooking Power Up like Glaceon, Flareon, and Magnezone, and you're carrying over the pot size from Sunday to Monday, and in Monday morning, you run a full team of, say, 5 Dedenne, like this, and you don't cook that first meal until you get as much crit chance as possible stacked up together. So just before 12 PM hits, hopefully you've built up that crit chance to maybe higher than 50%, and then you cook that first meal. Well, with your pot size maybe over 200 in size, every extra ingredient being worth double, and the effects are roll on into the whole week. So unlike Sunday, when you cook, all the ingredients only give you more drowsy power for 1 or 2 remaining sessions. Doing this on a Monday gives you greater drowsy power for every day of the remaining week. So the third point is that while Tasty Chance S is even higher value if you use it on Sunday, because your dish becomes 3 times the value when you crit, and also there's a higher crit chance, the dish you make gives you numerically a bigger amount of strength than every other day. But unfortunately, that amount of drowsy power may not be useful to you if it's only available for the 1 or 2 sessions afterwards. And if you've seen my other video talking about extreme drowsy power amounts, so we're talking about above 300, 500, or 600 million drowsy power, well, further drowsy power gains tend to be lost because you're not actually getting spawns that return your investment. You're not getting any better sleep styles by further increasing that drowsy power beyond a certain amount. So if you were to crit a powerful dish on Sunday, but you're already at a very high drowsy power, then Dedenne's skill becomes diminishing in returns because you're not utilizing that drowsy power. So to me, even though numerically Dedenne or Cramorant, the skill is worth more on a Sunday, the actual real returns are worth more if the crit chance comes on a Monday. The fourth point I want to make is that if you're relatively new to the game, don't use Tasty Chance S because, well, first of all, you probably haven't unlocked or have the ingredient farmers for the strongest dishes. In order to utilize Tasty Chance S well, you need to be able to cook strong dishes, which was the first point. If you haven't unlocked some of these ingredients like corn, or if you don't have good farmers that can help you farm enough ingredients to cook those strong dishes throughout the week, the value of Tasty Chance S is diminished. But for late game players, especially those who heavily focus on cooking dishes, Dedenne can be worth a lot. I'm now thinking that Dedenne's skill is in the meta. Now, I haven't actually compared it to using another Pokemon in its place because in order to use Dedenne, you first have to remove a Pokemon from your team. Are you going to remove a berry specialist? Are you going to remove an ingredient specialist? Or are you going to remove a healer? Which Pokemon are you going to remove in order to have Dedenne on the team? And how is that going to affect your total strength? And that will be a part 2 of this mini series. However, just for this video, we're looking at how to value Tasty Chance S. Although, having said that, you could see Dedenne as very meta relevant in the sense that, well, you could just over farm your ingredients the week before and once again have Tasty Chance S Pokemon on your team first thing Monday morning, have them trigger as much as possible, then cook your first strongest dish. Now, even if it should fail to crit the first strongest dish, try to maintain cooking strong dishes until the crit actually happens, then if you need to, swapping over to a weaker dish. And that is how you maximize the value of Tasty Chance S. So that was actually point number 5, is that when you decide to stack the crit chance from Tasty Chance S, you should be prepared to cook only strong dishes until the crit happens. Otherwise, you're not going to see as much value in the skill if it should crit on a weak dish. The 6th point is that for berry focused players, we're talking about players who run 4 berry specialists or even 5 berry specialists. They rarely care about ingredients, or people who just don't play that much and open the game that much, who heavily rely on berry specialists and sneaky snacking to farm the Snorlax strength. Well, for you guys, don't use Dedenne because you're just not going to see the value in return for using Dedenne since your dishes are going to be relatively weaker. So for those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that Piggy, a free-to-play player, generally just cooks whatever she can cook. She doesn't focus on cooking the strongest dishes. So in that sense, Dedenne is not really the Pokemon for her. Should she get a good one? Maybe at some point, because it can be utilized in that strategy where we carry over the expand pot into Mondays and then stack crit chance as much as possible to make the first or second or third meal have a higher crit chance, especially useful at the start of an event week. So point number 7 is that for those of you who do use time traveling, well, you can actually start your new week early by going to Kiribati at 4 AM in the morning, especially at the start of an event week, and then you can spend more than 24 hours before you have to cook breakfast by traveling back in time to Niue or Hawaii or some other region until the last region on Earth that hits 12 PM of Monday. You have that much time to actually build up your crit chance. For those of you who don't do time traveling, don't worry about this point. And the 8th and final point is that extra tasty is going to be extra good during an event where ingredients and dishes are powered up. For example, we just had the Summer Festival event where dishes were powered up by 1.5 times. Well, guess what? Dedenne's skill, Tasty Chance S, is worth more. So now that we know that Dedenne's skill is very good if you're using it to maximize your dish power at the start of the week, especially if you've got a huge expanded pot, the next question is, what about from a day-to-day perspective? Let's just say you're not using that strategy to maximize your first meal for an event or something like that. Let's just say it's an average week, you're starting your week as normal, and you just want to farm ingredients and berries. Is Dedenne actually worth using on the team with its skill tasty chance S. Now I keep saying Dedenne here. I know Cramorant also does the skill, but the skill trigger rate is just above half of that of Dedenne. So Dedenne is still the king of this skill. That's why I keep referring to Dedenne when I'm talking about tasty chance S. In a previous video, I explained that the strength is a 4% increase of your dish if you triggered once. But that was an extremely simple scenario. In a previous video where I had to cover this skill very briefly, I explained that Dedenne at level 1 main skill, let's say it triggers once, then it is worth 4% strength. Now that is the most basic of the scenario for the power of this skill. Because what that assumes is that you'll only cook one dish during the week and not cook any other dish during the week because the average strength improvement is 4%. But now we are going to look at this skill for real and actually try to come up with an average strength value on this skill. Now, I've had to speak to multiple people to verify how this works. It's complex. I've actually never studied this type of maths in my life, so I've had to do a bit of reading on my own to understand how this works. But first, let me run you through a simple scenario of how I came to understand this skill. So first, let's take a look at Dedenne's skill if it's at level 6, so 10% increase in crit rate every time you trigger the skill. And in this scenario, we are going to assume that Dedenne triggers one time per meal. I'm going to ignore the base rate of the dish first, so there will be nothing here. The crit rate is 10%. The multiplier if crit, so in other words, extra tasty, is 2 times. For various reasons. 1, to keep the scenario simple. 2, the crit on Sunday, even though it's very powerful, is worth less to me because, once again, you only get 1 or 2 sessions left. The multiplier, if no crit, is just 1. Now, I call this the simulation rate tree for a 10% chance, tasty chance S, 1 proc per meal, so triggering 1 time for every meal, and there's no base crit rate. And how this tree works is like this. If you trigger Dedenne's skill, there's a 10% chance for it to give you 2 times the dish strength. So then the expected value is 10% of 2 times. So in other words, 1 out of 10 times you get 2 times the strength. But 9 out of 10 times it won't crit, then you get 1 times the strength. So the expected value is 0.9. So the sum of these two is the total average expected value of a 10% chance to crit a dish, which is actually the same result as a base crit rate. So triggering a level 6 tasty chance S on Dedenne is exactly the same as the base crit rate. In this case, where there's no base crit rate, that makes sense. The trick though is what comes after. But let's complete the first row first. So 0.9 plus 0.2 gives us 1.1. So we've cooked 1 dish so far. So per dish, it's 1.1 times whatever the strength of the base dish is. All right, so what if you cook 2 dishes? Now this is where it gets interesting, because if Dedenne's skill didn't crit the first dish, then it stacks another 10% chance on. So now there's a 20% chance of a 2 times multiplier, 80% chance of a 1 times multiplier, if in the first dish it didn't crit. If it did crit though, over here in this branch, then it's back to 1 out of 10 times it will crit again, 9 out of 10 times it won't crit. So in other words, the chance of you critting twice is 0.1 times 0.1. So this branch here, 0.1 times 0.1 is 1%, so 0.01. So this number here is the cumulative odds of this branch happening. What that means is for Dedenne to crit your dish twice in a row. Your first dish crit and your second dish also crit. If you've critted twice, then you'll have 4 times the strength of a single dish because you've cooked 2 dishes, both critted. So the expected value is 4 times 1%. Not very much, but that is the odds of running this branch. In another branch, let's say I crit the first dish, but I did not crit the second dish. There's a 10% chance of critting the first dish, 90% chance of not critting the second dish. So the overall odds is 0.1 times 0.9, which is 9% chance to get 3 times the strength of one single base dish. Because the first dish is 2 times the value, the second dish is only 1 times the value, so the total is 3 times the value. The expected outcome is the product of these two numbers, 3 times the value, 9% of the time, 0.27. And so on. You can do the same maths here. We have an 18% chance of this branch where you don't crit the first dish, but you do crit the second dish. And it makes sense because the odds of critting has increased if your first dish didn't crit. And this is the expected value. And once again, the chance of not critting twice is 72%, because it's 90% chance to not crit the first time, but the second time is 80% chance. Now, if we were only talking about the base crit rate, which doesn't stack unlike Dedenne's skill, then it would be 90% chance every time it doesn't crit for it to not crit again, which is actually just a simple binomial distribution, which we're not talking about today. For Dedenne though, it's not quite a binomial distribution because the average outcome of the second dish, so the expected value of all of these situations summed up, depends on what actually happens in the first scenario. And you can do the same for the third dish, and it depends on what actually happens in the second dish. Now, if you sum up the expected value, which gives you the average overall strength increase compared to a single base dish, you would get 2.29. But you've cooked 2 dishes, so you're going to divide that by 2. So each dish is an increase of 15% extra strength. Now, before we go any further, you should understand that these numbers mean something very specific. It means that if you only ever cook 1 dish the entire week, then Dedenne's 10% crit chance is just providing you an average of 10% extra strength. If you only ever cook 2 dish during the entire week, then Dedenne's skill per trigger would give you an overall of 15% extra strength on your dishes. So that increase from only cooking 1 dish to only cooking 2 dishes by 5% is because of these branches that have increased crit rate if the crit were to fail in the previous dish. So another way to put it is that if you only ever cook 1 dish per week, well, you can't see the roll-on effects of Dedenne's skill being pushed to the next meal. The more meals you cook, the more Dedenne can keep stacking that crit chance up, so you get these branches here where you keep failing, and then a success or a fail, success, or a fail, success. All of these expected value are higher than that of a regular binomial distribution with crit chance, for example, just having the base crit rate. So another way to put it is that 10% you get from Dedenne is worth more than the 10% of a base crit rate, because base crit rate doesn't stack. And when we get to the third dish, it's an 18% increase in strength per dish for all 3 dishes. So not just for 1 dish, every dish gets an average of an 18% increase from Tasty Chance S being triggered once per meal. Now, these numbers are just an analogy to show you what happens when we stack crit rate. Because if I did the same analysis using only the base crit rate, what I would get is 1.1 for every single number. So in order for me to get the most accurate average increase in dish strength using Dedenne, the way to do it is actually keep repeating this process until we get to 21 dishes cooked. Why 21? Because there's 7 days in a week, 3 meals, and 7 times 3 is 21. There are a total of 21 dishes that you can cook. Of course, for Sunday, we'll actually have to modify these numbers with a base rate of 30%. For weekdays, we would need to modify these numbers with a base rate of 10%. For the weekdays, I've actually done it in this situation here. The base rate is 10% chance to crit. Crit rate is still 10% if you're triggering once per meal using Dedenne, so 3 triggers in a day. The multiplier is still 2 times. If crit, of course, then the first meal would have a 20% chance to crit, a crit giving 2 times the value, so the expected value is 0.4 because it's a product of these two. And in the first meal, on average, you would have 1.2 times the dish strength. So once again, if Dedenne's skill didn't stack, what would happen is we would see 1.2 in every row down here. But because it stacks, because of these branches that you can no crit and then crit with a higher chance to crit, the expected value goes up. In the second dish, if you cook 2 dishes in a week, is 1.24, so 24% more dish strength per dish. So 2 dishes, both getting 24% increase in strength. If you cook 3 dishes in a week, then it's 27% increase for all dishes in a week. So you can see that the number goes up as we do more iterations of these dishes. But unfortunately, I can't keep repeating this process to come up with the average value from Dedenne's Tasty Chance S. And the reason is I would need to keep expanding this tree until there are 2 million branches. Because every time I cook a dish, 2 new branches spawn. As you can see from these boxes here, there's 2 boxes at first, so there's either crit or no crit, but then there's 4 boxes, meaning it's crit, 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 no crit, no crit, crit, no crit, no crit. So there's already 4 situations by the second dish. If I were to calculate the number at 21 dishes, there would be 2 to the power of 21, which is 2 million branches. So there would be 2 million boxes horizontally running across this Excel spreadsheet that I just simply cannot do. But some very smart people have come up with either a way around that, number 1, and number 2, or just straight up calculate the numbers, which I'm going to refer you to right now. But what I do want to bring up is that as we go up in the number of dishes cooked, the number seems to plateau, especially considering that with the no crit branch, as you no crit too much, you will hit the crit maximum. The expected value will not go up as much. So here we can see that comparing only cooking 1 dish in a week versus cooking only 2 dishes in a week, well, there's a 4% increase in the total strength per dish. But by the third iteration, there's only a 3% increase because 24% to 26.9% is a smaller jump than 20 to 24. So you can see the number starts to plateau in terms of the percentage strength increase. And I'm going to refer you to this chart here, which was made by some very smart people in the Pokemon Sleep Math Cord. So this analysis was done by Abunzu on the Pokemon Sleep Math Cord back in January when Dedenne first released to consider whether its skill is any good. And the reason why it took me so long to come around to talking about this is because the maths are very complex, as you can see from my Excel spreadsheet, which was just getting you a step into the door of understanding Tasty Chance S. So what Abunzu has done, and you can read this yourself over on their Discord page, but also via this Google document, which I won't go through, but it has a lot of nice information as well, showing how they went through the simulations. But what essentially Abunzu did is use a process called a Monte Carlo simulation. What that means is, well, we're not empirically trying to figure out how much dish strength will increase on average. What we'll do is we'll run a lot of simulations and look at the average strength that occurs. For example, the same way that we collected data for our Cram-O-Matic results during the last summer festival event, and then we figured out the average rate. But what this one does is it runs simulations as opposed to using real people data. And simulations can be done a lot quicker and with a lot more data points. So by inputting the parameters of tasty chance S. So for example, Dedenne's skill can trigger up to a maximum of 70% bonus. If it's Sunday, it's worth 3 times. If it's weekday, it's worth 2 times if it crits. And then if it doesn't crit, the skill chance would stack onto the next meal. If we were to run 1 million samples of this happening, what will we find to be the base strength increase by using Dedenne's skill? And I really like looking at these numbers because it gives us a good idea of how good Dedenne's skill actually is. These numbers are a lot more useful than these numbers. These numbers almost say absolutely nothing because you need to consider every situation where it doesn't crit as well, not just every situation where it does crit. We talked about all the branches on my spreadsheet. So they didn't even have to do empirical mathematics. They just went and determined the rate by punching in a lot of simulations and just found out that the average strength was 33.5% at best if you have 6 triggers of Dedenne every day at level 6 tasty chance. So what this means is that every dish will go up 33.5% strength if you have these parameters, 6 triggers a day and level 6 main skill. And these numbers include the fact that Sunday has 3 times the value and has a higher base rate, which actually isn't a good thing because it's not as valuable when it triggers on Sunday if you considered all the points that I mentioned earlier. Now, just to help you understand this number already accounts for the fact that there is a base chance to crit as well. So normally without running Dedenne or any tasty chance S Pokemon, the average strength is actually 17% higher than the base strength of a dish because normally you can crit and there's a 3 times multiplier on Sunday. So it averages out to be about 17% extra strength. So this number is an increase on top of that. And you can see that by going to their Google document. When they did the simulation, you can see a 56% increase compared to the regular base strength of a dish, which is actually 33% higher compared to the base strength, including the base crit rate. But what is also interesting is that you can see as you increase the number of procs per day, the jump in the total base strength increase actually goes lower with each proc. So the first time you trigger Dedenne's main skill at level 6, you get a 10.5% boost to your dish strength on average throughout the whole week. So you only need to trigger it once to get that average boost. So that's a 10% jump compared to 0. But it's only a 6% jump in strength compared to having 1 proc when you have 2 Dedenne procs, and then 5%, 4%, 4%, and then closer to 3% increase with each proc. So there is a diminishing increase as you increase the number of procs per day for Dedenne. But it's not getting worse because overall you're still getting more strength per dish. It's just that the numbers are not increasing as much as when you procced the first time. So all those numbers up until this point were not practical numbers. None of them apply actual realistic skill triggers per day using your Pokemon. In order for you to know exactly what kind of boost you would get for dish strength using Dedenne's skill, you need to use the RainNX calculator. And like I said, I can't help you to empirically determine that base strength increase. You just have to trust this calculator because it'll take me 2 million branches on the Excel spreadsheet to actually calculate the average strength. But first, before we look at Dedenne, how does the multiplier actually work with base crit rate? So the 10% on weekday, 30% chance on Sunday. If you look on the calculator, I'm on production comparison right now. This is the multiplier on the dish strength, 1.1714 times. What that means is there is a 17% increase in your ingredient strength because any ingredient you feed into the pot normally has a 10 or 30% chance to crit, and it averages out to be 17%. However, if we now put Dedenne into the comparison, you can see that Dedenne's skill trigger, so let's say about 3.5 triggers in a day, will increase the strength of your ingredients or your dishes by 1.32 times as opposed to 1.17 times. So it is this difference, 1.32 to 1.7, that is the power of running Dedenne. It is not actually just this number here. This would have been the case if we only had one iteration, if you're only looking at ever cooking one dish per week. Now this Dedenne is at level 1, so we're going to set everything to level 50, and we're also going to give the Dedenne 5 main skill seeds to make it the best it can be. I'm going to give it skill trigger M, and I'm going to give it helping speed as well, and then main skill chance up. My settings are perfectly healed, so always 2.22 times multiplier on production and no sleeping at all. Then Dedenne can trigger 8 times a day if you don't sleep. This is just to simulate what Dedenne is like when you're awake. If you're awake half the time, so if you sleep 12 hours, then it'll be half that. So you get about 4 triggers of Dedenne in a day. I can also set this as 8:30. So if I sleep 8.5 hours a day, then you get about 5.8 triggers with a pretty damn good Dedenne stats. Nearly 6 triggers in a day, Dedenne increases your dish strength by 46%, but not forgetting there's a base of 17%. We get a 25% increase in dish strength if we have a really good Dedenne, and we run it for the entire week. Now don't ask me why that number is a bit lower than this number here, 33.5%, level 6 and skill trigger 6 times a day. I'm still trying to figure that out. But when I spoke with Rainanix, the calculations done on the website is a little different to using the Monte Carlo simulation. The way that he does it is what is known as a Markov chain. And I actually had to go watch a YouTube video to learn about this. And I welcome you guys to look it up as well. But a Markov chain is basically where one outcome depends on the last outcome that occurred. And then you look at the average outcome of how likely things are to happen, which is exactly what Tasty Chance is. So Rainanix uses a Markov chain in order to determine these rates, which should be the way to figure out the rates empirically. So it sounds genuine to me, I just can't correlate the two charts at this stage, but hopefully this video has shed some light into how to best run Tasty Chance S and whether it may be useful to you. In the next video, we're going to actually put Dedenne into a team and compare and contrast to see whether it beats a top berry team or whether it beats a top ingredient dish team. Thank you for watching, guys. If you guys want to see more videos like these, don't forget to like and subscribe.